just a bit of background, really, about the Canal and River Trust. We are a charitable trust. We was formed about just over 10 years ago now, originally from the state-owned British Waterways, which was obviously a government department. This was transferred into a charitable trust. And effectively, we manage and own around 2,000 miles of waterway. This is specifically across England and Wales. In places like Scotland and Ireland, they have their own sort of inland waterways bodies. But we see ourselves as both a waterways and a well-being charity because, you know, we provide a significant amounts of recreational and active travel benefits for the communities that we serve. There's millions of people within the population who have access to their canals within a 1 kilometre distance. So we believe that we can provide great access to green and blue space and green and blue infrastructure, but also we have a lot of the environmental benefits. So with such a well interconnected, vast network, we obviously have a huge amount of different wildlife habitats and protected species, as well as protected sites such as SSSIs and special area of conservations. And it's our job within the sort of heritage and environment teams to manage the historic fabric, whether that would be listed buildings or listed structures, as well as the natural environment aspects, as I've already mentioned. So we've got a wealth of heritage on the canals. A lot of them were built over 250 years ago, but they've got a lot of interesting connections with other water bodies across the country, especially some of the big rivers where there's navigation occurring. So we've got a navigational purpose in terms of providing safe boating along our network, as well as all of the other different uses that there are. And effectively, we manage around just under 3,000 bridges, over about 1,500 locks and 335 aqueducts, alongside all of our reservoirs, over 70 reservoirs, and a number of feeder channels that provide water resources and water supply to our network. So we're broken up into a series of different regions, but the project area you'll see covers around 4 of these operating regions. So today we're talking about invasive species, but it's obviously the best thing to do is get the terminology right, because there is some words that are often interchangeable, and some of them are not specifically related to the invasive element of non-native species as well. So in the UK, we tend to define those which are native as being present before the end of the last ice age, the last glacial period. And what we term as non-native or alien species. Aliens often used in other European countries in America, but we tend to use the term non-native, is plants and animals that have been transported out of their native range, often by people accidentally or even intentionally. And we estimate that humans arrived approximately 8,000 years ago, and brought a lot of non-native species that originally weren't there before this time. So there's around, the Non-Native Species Secretariat and JNCC estimate around 2,000 non-native species have been introduced into the UK, all around the globe, whether that's from commercial activities, trade, whether it's been intentional planting from different aspects of the horticultural industry. There's a number of different pathways in which these species can arrive, especially during the Victorian period, when we had a lot of interesting exotic animals and plants introduced to the UK, which sadly have spread into the wider environment, and some of which have become what we term invasive. So we estimate around 10 to 15% of these that have arrived have become what we term invasive non-native species. So the invasive element really, it pivots on one major factor in the sense that these species are capable of causing significant environmental disruption, especially where they establish. So they tend to be quite widespread. They tend to colonise very effectively, but they can cause a host of quite serious problems for a whole raft of different aspects of society. Obviously, the key element from an environmental perspective is the damage it can do to other wildlife and ecosystems, especially their functionality. But also there are human health aspects. Certain plants can be quite dangerous and produce toxic substances that can impact on people's health. But also the economy in the built environment, it costs a lot of money to manage such species, especially the ones that have become very well established. So there's a cost from that, but also, as water companies will very much know, there's damage in terms of supply lines. Certain species can cause damage to pipe networks, affect water intakes, and cause real problems on reservoirs as well. So, there's an economical aspect, but also the built environment that some of these species are very resilient and can cause impact to national and local and regional infrastructure as well. So when we talk about invasives, we can actually revert to native or non-native. So certain species within the UK that are native, if they become too dominant or abundant within a specific habitat, that could be classified as an invasive species. However, when we talk about it in most contexts, we're relating to those which are non-native, and they're the ones that tend to cause the biggest amount of issues for us. They're often very, very successful once they become established. And it's important to point out that in their host range, so where they're originally from, there tends to be obviously more control agents. So their spread is often far more limited in comparison to when they become established in a new territory or a new environment. And the lack of natural predators to control numbers and limited spread becomes a real problem. And just an image from the Non-Native Species Secretariat of the American mink, which has caused significant declines in one of our favourite small mammals in terms of water voles. It's caused quite a significant decline. It's a quite a well-documented case, but again, it can be animals or plants that are causing said issues. So just a little bit on legislation. There's quite a lot of different legislation out there. Some EU regulations with regards to the prevention and management of introduced and spread of invasive alien species. The Wildlife and Countryside Act in the UK obviously covers quite a number of different schedules on protection of protected sites and nesting birds, etc. But there is specific elements of that legislation which cover the Schedule 9 invasive plant species as well. But I think for especially for CIEEM members, it's really important to think about the Water Framework Directive as well. And as you know, the WFD assessments are both biological quality elements as well as chemical quality elements. And invasive species, especially in terms of the biological aspect, that can have a significant impact on water bodies achieving good ecological status. And it's quite timely, really, because the Environment Act, obviously published in 2021. Following that, we've just recently had the publication of the Environment Improvement Plan set out by DEFRA. And there's a specific chapter on biosecurity where it talks about managing invasive species and dealing with potential biosecurity risks. And that's also set out in the GB's Invasive Non-Native Species Strategy with an updated version, which should be coming out soon. So there is quite a drive within policy and legislation as well to deal with these issues. So when we talk about invasive species, for this project, we're specifically talking about a certain group of invasive plants. And invasive plants can really cause quite a big host of impacts, really. I guess one of the key ones is it's their ability to outcompete native species. They often grow very quickly. As you can see on the image on the right, this is Himalayan balsam on one of our disused canals. And effectively the whole area has just been completely colonised. And once it gets to this level, it's very difficult to manage the issue. So early targeted management and risk reduction is really important. But obviously there is a biodiversity impact in terms of the overall species diversity. And for the plants like Himalayan balsam, which attract a lot of pollinators, that might be seen as a good thing on the surface, but actually plants like this can attract pollinators away from native species and cause declines potentially in those. So, there's a direct impact there for biological diversity. As I mentioned previously, some can cause serious health impacts. The one that most people know is giant hogweed. Giant hogweed produces quite a nasty sap, which can lead to phytophotodermatitis, which is quite a nasty skin condition and can cause severe burns. So once the substance is on your skin, especially when you're exposed to UV radiation using light, it can cause repeated swelling and burns and blisters, which is obviously treatable in hospital, and it can last for a very long time. There's been quite a lot on the radio about this. So that's one specifically where there's a human health risk and has to be dealt with very seriously. The same image on the right really shows the impact of soil erosion as well from the establishment of some of these species, especially on aquatic freshwater ecosystems. They can cause severe bank erosion, but also localised flooding as well. This is the Braidley branch where we've had significant amounts of soil loss from the the outer offside bank, but also we've had localised flooding in the properties behind due to the complete density within the summer season. It can cause quite significant issues from that aspect. And obviously we talk about ecosystem functionality as well, and resilience of ecosystems, especially in the face of climate change and other pressures such as pollution and physical modification and intervention. Invasive species, if they become very successful, they can completely impact on the different interactions between specific species, and as we've said before, outcompete some of our more important protected species as well. So the functionality of the ecosystem can be severely depleted, and this is a global issue. It's one of the biggest global environmental issues, and there's some really sad cases of areas, especially some Pacific islands and the like, where it's only taken one or two species that can cause complete devastation. So that's something to bear in mind. And as I've said before, the economic impacts. But I've just took a snippet from the Environment Improvement Plan, as you can see on the right-hand side. And they talk about water bodies achieving near natural state, similar to the good ecological status, but in terms of their original state of what they are. And non-native invasive species is accountable for approximately a quarter of those water bodies not achieving that, alongside some of the bigger, more known issues such as wastewater discharges, agricultural runoff, pesticides, and the like. So they're sadly a big player in some of the issues in terms of achieving a good ecological status or potential. So yeah, the Canal and River Invasive Species Eradication Project is specifically a 4-year project. Severn Trent funded around £600,000 as part of a strategic partnership with the Canal and River Trust, because we see that we have issues that we can both tackle together, and that we are able to deliver a lot of the benefits for water bodies within the Severn Trent supply area. So this has been quite a successful partnership so far, and we was very fortunate to win the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management NGO Impact Award last year, specifically because we showed the examples of where we've tried sort of not only conventional techniques, but some stuff that has potentially never been trialled before, slight variations on stuff, more novel stuff that has been achieved. So in 2021 and 2022, obviously we come into the end of the second financial year of the project very soon. We've delivered around 240 kilometres of management across our waterways, and in addition to that, we've done some research elements as well. So it's really a dual combination between invasive vegetation management as well as research outputs. There's 4 priority species, 2 aquatic and 2 terrestrial. The 2 terrestrial being Japanese knotweed, which a lot of you will be familiar with, as well as giant hogweed. But for canal systems, they function very different to rivers. They are surface water bodies, but they operate very differently, often very slow flow. Sediment functions are very different as well, and nutrient dynamics. So floating pennywort and water fern are 2 really problematic ones, especially within the West Midlands and the East Midlands region of the Trust. And we've also done some trials for Himalayan balsam as well. We do invite anyone from academia who potentially want to join some of these trials, do some research outputs with us, then by all means drop me a line. So this is just some data points that I've plotted for specifically just for Japanese knotweed. You can see the Severn Trent boundary across there, and I highlight the different canal waterways that we own and manage. And those are the predominant regions that we cover: the West Midlands, East Midlands, Wales and South West, North West and Yorkshire and North East. But the majority of the invasives work is taking place across the West and East Midlands. But you can see just from that satellite image in the map that all of the Japanese knotweed areas, that obviously the West Midlands is very densely populated with these species on our canals. And often in urban areas, we have some very severe issues. But that doesn't mean that it's just urban areas. There are some linear areas of waterway, even in some of the most rural locations, where we do have some of these species recorded and we have to manage. So our ultimate goal by the end of the project really is to have gotten at least covered 250 kilometres. We know that we're not going to be able to eradicate every single site. That's very much an unrealistic ambition. But there are areas where we're actually having a massive impact, and especially on the aquatic front, we've had some real success on some of our key priority sites. So it's a case of trying to do as much reduction as possible, but also informing the way that we approach certain issues, and whether some of the research that we do can give us even more of an armory of dealing with some of these species. So Japanese knotweed giant hogweed, we had to undertake. We obviously had a lot of asset data ourselves on invasive species, but to be honest with you, it wasn't coordinated and managed as best as we would like. So the project really required some very extensive surveying, both desktop studies and looking at our existing data, but then also doing a lot of ground truth surveying. So some of our contractors helped us do a lot of mapping across the different functional kilometres of our waterways. And the additional works from the grant has allowed us to do some more work. So predominantly for Japanese knotweed giant hogweed, it's the use of herbicide, and glyphosate is the only approved use. But we must ensure that we follow sort of the sustainable use regulations. And we've tried to do different techniques as well, such as hot foam, and the use of electricity as well. But sadly, due to the linear structure of our network, a lot of these alternative technologies, which are improving and getting better, do require large vehicles and generators and lots of water and fuel consumption as well. So the structure of our network can limit us in terms of the practical options, but we're always looking to trial new techniques. The big area where we've done quite a lot of detailed surveying is on our green flag awarded canals. These are canals that have been awarded the green flag due to the different aspects of criteria, and that's also been set out in the Green Infrastructure Framework, which has recently been published by Natural England. So we're trying to overall reduce our use on herbicide for these species, but at the same time, in terms of a life cycle analysis, I think Cardiff City Council will be producing a report very soon to look at the comparisons of the life cycle analysis of using different techniques, some of which, although appear to be low environmental impact from their use, actually has a significant consumption of other aspects such as water and energy as well. So it's a very much a difficult issue, but these species are very widespread, as you can see from the numbers in those that are in active management across the different regions. We've also, you can see from this map on the right hand side, this is one of our former dredging tips. So used to have an Environment Agency permit in where dredgings from canals could be disposed of, but the area is very much built up now. It's almost effectively a local nature reserve, but you can see just from the mapping that we did, there's a significant amount of Japanese knotweed on site, and we was looking at maybe alternatives such as mechanical excavation and screening, and that can be quite risky from a biosecurity perspective, but there is quite a lot of good evidence, and developers tend to use these, but they're very high cost of doing screening of Japanese knotweed rhizome. We would estimate around 1,800 cubic meters of soil would have to be screened with on-site incineration and selective reuse of soils, and burying those at a great enough a depth where we would prevent regrowth coming to the surface. But it's a very difficult and challenging operation, but it's something that we're looking at. But obviously this is a very contaminated site in terms of heavy metals and other contaminants due to its former use as a dredging tip. So it has to be planned out very well and done very effectively. So this is a potential that we're looking at. But as I say, this is a high cost, high risk option. But you know, there's potential to improve the site following something like this, where we could do targeted reseeding, or at least try and improve some of the existing habitats on site as well. So in terms of Himalayan balsam, we did a trial, which is an ongoing trial. It's going to be going on for the remainder of the project, really. But we've got a feeder off the River Severn in Wales. It takes water from the River Severn and goes into the Montgomery Canal, which is a triple SI and a special area of conservation. But this is sort of the non-navigable section. The Trust does have plans to restore aspects of the Montgomery, which is ongoing at the moment. But this section, which is quite far south, is a feeder that obviously is important in terms of water supply long term, but also it's got a lot of designated sites around this feeder, and balsam was identified as quite a severe issue on our land and the neighbouring nature reserve as well. So we decided that we was already dredging the feeder as part of our sort of statutory obligations, but there was a number of different invasive species on site, and we thought, well, our contractor helped design a new trial where we effectively wanted to use natural materials to see if we could suppress the growth of the plant on site, and then trying to seed it with a sort of a native seed mix as well, and using some type of biodegradable barrier to limit regrowth following the trial. So effectively what we did was before we dredged the feeder, we installed biodegradable Hessian matting, but we could only do that to around 2 to 3 meters width because the bank was very steep, as you'll see in the photos. And we did that in the winter when all of the above ground mass was effectively died back. And we dredged the silts from the feeder, and under a D1 exemption and NRW's agreement, we was able to spread those out along the Hessian matting to form a new substrate. If you've never seen hydroseeding, it's a really interesting way of being able to effectively spray your seed mix with a fertiliser and water onto quite a big area in a short period of time. So we used a specific seed mix to cover the silt with native grasses and wildflowers. The one concern was whether there was going to be viable seeds within the actual silt, which fortunately it didn't appear that there was, and we couldn't really, was speaking to different labs to try and screen it, but we didn't really have enough time to do so. But that was obviously a risk. But the fact that the area was very contaminated anyway, we was hopeful that it would actually make an improvement. But the other areas where we had sort of very steep banks, we had to use manual removal and bank commander because we couldn't put obviously dredged material on a steep bank because it would just go back into the feeder. So here's some of the photos of the operation. You can see in the top left-hand corner the excavator arm dredging the feeder. And what we could do effectively was trying to dredge some of the sediment onto the mat and then move down a slow process rate and then hydroseed as we go along. So you can see on the far right the development of some of the vegetation. And then there were some areas where we did the mowing trials as well, which we continue to do. But overall, on the bottom left photo you'll see, I've got some good drone footage as well, which we will share video in the chat function, where you can see the area where we did do the silt and the Hessian. There was very much a limited regrowth, but unfortunately, you know, with steep banks, we've had to do more manual remove, more on targeted, and it only takes one Himalayan balsam plant to contaminate the whole area. But it was just to see whether it would work, and you know, there has been some specific suppression of the plant, but we need sort of our ecologists to go out and pretend to do a botanical survey, hopefully this year, and see whether we can develop a longer term management plan. But it's always interesting to try new techniques. The big one for us really, hydrocotily, floating pennyworth. Canals are obviously, as I said before, very slow flow. Some of them are very eutrophic, and also sediments can be an issue in terms of nutrient stores as well. So this tends to be quite a big issue for us, and we've got some big areas, some of them on some of our protected sites as well. And in 2021, we covered around 11 kilometres of waterway, but we focused specifically in the West Midlands because there was a number of triple SIs, and one of our special areas of conservation, which specific units of that designated site were not in favourable condition, and a large majority of that was due to pollution and invasive non-native species. So this was very targeted, and we had to be very careful in terms of how we did that, and have to get assent from Natural England to do such works. And then as we moved into 2022, we expanded this to cover an even bigger area, an additional 24 kilometres, looking at the northwest region where the Shropshire Union Canal and the East Midlands on the River Soar in partnership with Leicester City Council. And the photos that you see there is from the Fens Branch Canal along Stourbridge, where we've done quite a lot of targeted work. But you cannot do this one time and expect the plant to disappear. They're termed invasive for a reason, so it takes a lot of repeat treatments, a lot of repeat management, and if you don't have that targeted investment over a long period of time, then you will return back to the same state which you started out with, which is obviously not desirable at all. There's just some more before and after features. This is on one of our feeder suppliers, so from Bittle Reservoirs, 3 big reservoirs down in Worcestershire that supplies the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, which we've had long-term issues with floating pennyworm, and we've tried to remove silts as well as remove the plant. But we always try to improve the sustainability performance of our operations. So we try not to take much material off-site. We try to dispose of material on land as long as there's no risk of re-entry, and that's in areas which are ideally not accessible to people, and especially grazing animal as well, because the risk of potential contaminants such as copper and zinc. We don't want grazing animals to be feeding in these areas, especially if they've got high concentrations within plants and sediments as well. So there's a lot of factors that we have to take into account. When we dispose to bank on triple SIs or SACs, Natural England and NRW often require us to leave it on the bank for 24 hours and then take it off-site disposal under assent from the regulator. So it's slightly different in terms of protected sites. The Shropshire Union Canal was done this year. This had quite a significant disruption to boaters, specifically travelling north from sort of Chester up to Ellesmere Port, where our National Waterways Museum is. This caused a lot of problems for navigation. In some years, it's caused almost complete restriction of navigation due to this plant specifically, which obviously has a financial cost and also a reputational cost as well, in case we need to ensure that we're dealing with that properly. We removed around 125 tonnes of the plant. We had to use water-based plant, so additional water-based excavators to actually take the plant from our hoppers, where you can see the storage bays there, and to dispose of it on our land, because we didn't want to risk structural damage from taking heavy machinery on near side, bank side areas to dispose of the plant. So we had to be quite careful in the selection of the equipment that we was using, and also ensure that we installed booms and had areas where once crafts were lifted out, they could be washed down appropriately and follow biosecurity procedures as well. So it might seem quite easy at the start, but just being able to get crafts into water bodies in itself can be quite challenging. So you will have to find suitable areas to lift in machinery and move machinery around without causing disruption to our customers as well. This was also delivered this year in partnership with Leicester City Council on the River Soar, which notoriously has problems with floating pennyworm over quite big areas. But specifically within Leicester City, Abbey Park, which is a really good piece of green infrastructure. It's a very well used park in the middle of the city centre, where the River Soar goes through, and the Grand Union Canal flows on either side of the park, as you can see from that satellite imagery I've outlined there. It's been difficult because different organisations have been doing different aspects, and that's where we're trying to ensure that there's better coordination. So the Environment Agency do a lot of the targeted removal on some of the tributaries that feed into the River Soar. But Leicester City Council have got ambitions under their sort of environmental strategies as well to do better improvement to make some of these sites wilder and allow nature to recover and to thrive. And part of that is obviously managing said issues. So we teamed up with Leicester City Council. We had to do a lot of ecological surveys along the river as well. It was part of the river and part of the Grand Union Canal. But we thanks to Leicester City Council, we identified some active badger sets. So we had no disposal zones, areas of bankside where we just did not dispose of any material because of the risk potentially to badger activity and badger sets. So we have to make sure that we do a lot of checks beforehand. And if anything changes in the intervene of the works period whilst we're doing works, then we sometimes we will just have to decide to take material off site if required. So we have to ensure that it's done safely and appropriately for the area that we're covering. This was over 250 tonnes, so it does show you the amount of volume that can be generated from just this plant alone, especially in the peak summertime. It can grow up to around 20 centimetres, 23 centimetres a day. So you can have rapid expansion in the plant's growth, and obviously from a biodiversity and a water quality perspective, that can cause quite significant impacts. But by keeping stuff on site, technically on site, we're reducing carbon emissions from having to have wagons to take lots of vehicle trips back and forth to effective disposal facilities, and the cost of off-site disposal can easily double a project or a work activity that you're doing, because it costs a significant amount to take material off-site not only the fuel cost of that and carbon emissions, but the planning of that is also quite significant. So that's sort of one of the convoy boats that we was using on the River Stour, and you can see on the left-hand side we've had to do bankside, but we've had to get some of the volunteers as well to spread some of these areas out to keep it away from the bank to ensure that it doesn't re-enter, especially under flood conditions as well. But it just shows you the scale of how invasive this plant can be on both a river and canals together. Moving on to biological controls, especially for floating pennywort. CABI, the Centre for Agriculture and Bioscience International, are the main body doing research on biological controls, and they have to seek approval from DEFRA in order to obviously release biological controls and bring biological controls from the native country in which these control agents have been shown to be effective at controlling plants in their host range. And looking at ways in which we can test and experiment and look at lab and field trials to see, are those effective, but most importantly, as a nature-based solution, are they safe as well? So a significant amount of research is done by CABI, and there's a number of different partners, including ourselves, who are working on this, and we've done some releases in 2022 alongside the likes of Yorkshire Water and some of the others. So it was effectively granted ministerial approval in September 2021. And that's when CABI were issued with a releases license to do this. So they had to effectively ship lots of weevils from Argentina to facilitate looking at overwintering assessments to see how effective they are at overwintering, because during this cold snap, especially if you're taking species from tropical areas or areas where temperature variance is much greater, we have to see whether they can actually survive within the new conditions in terms of the places that they're released as well. And if you have a very cold snap in the winter period, that can obviously affect the efficacy of your biocontrol when you go into the next growing season as well. So their sort of CABI's early studies showed that there was, in some regards, successful overwintering and impacts on localised pennywort populations. And since 2021, they've released weevils at around 12 sites, and 4 of those being under this project with the Canal and River Trust. Here's just some quick stats from this. So obviously they have to rear the numbers within their polytunnels at their research stations, which can be quite a difficult thing to do. And the numbers that they would like to rear, obviously they can be quite limited in terms of weather conditions and the ability to be able to rear these and then get them actually out to the sites that require them for these research. So on average, there was around sort of 120 weevils released at each site. So we had the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, the Stour Navigation, the Worley Essington, and then Leeds and Liverpool, which was just outside the supply area, but was an additional site that was covered by the Trust. And as you can see, they look at the proportion of stems that have been mined. So the weevil will mine into the stolons and stems of the plant, and you'll see juveniles that then come up, as you can see in the image C, which effectively mine through the plant, and then there's leaf damage as well that we can see. But you can see that there's on some of the images we've got mature larvae which is mining through the stem, which is really cool to actually see that on site to show that that they are there, because it's very difficult to see them sometimes. So being able to see visible evidence that there's been new populations and breeding that's been effective to establish a population there, and to see associated localized leaf damage is really quite exciting. And we look at they looked at the proportion of stems that were mined 2 meters from the actual specific release site. You can see that they're all around sort of 50% and above. So there's definitely some spread across some of these localized areas. And we'll be monitoring these over the next few years, and hopefully have more top-up releases to really build up numbers in those areas. CABI have also been working for a number of years now on augmentative releases of another weevil from North America, and this is specifically for Azolla water fern. So a lot of people will request these weevils from CABI to control water fern, and it's quite a rare biocontrol in the sense that it's so highly effective. And on canals, because it's so low flow, the plant becomes quite easily established, especially where there is eutrophic conditions and a lack of navigation as well, because it doesn't get as much disturbance. We have to release weevils, and specifically along the Birmingham Canal navigations. This plant is quite a widespread issue on the Walsall Canal, Russell Canal, all of those which are interconnected. But this has been, as the weevil, this weevil specifically has been resident within the UK for at least the last 100 years. These releases are what we would classify as augmentative. So there is populations of these weevils already in the environment, but it's these additional targeted releases where the azolla is a problem that are used and supplied by CABI. From our research, in 2021, within about an 8-week period, 58% of sites showed near complete reduction, with some sites where there was less affected, but overall it was a vast majority. And looking at the following season, we had widespread control, which was great. So this is an example from sections of the Walsall Canal following biocontrol. It's quite hard to believe, but you know, it is very effective, and it's very quick. And the great part of that is the economic savings that are made. And we contributed to a paper that Corinne, who's the lead for CABI on this specific biological control, where they're looking at the economic value of using this as a biocontrol for water fern, especially over the last 100 years since it's become resident, and then there's been augmentative releases done. And we estimated that in 2021, we spent just over £2,000 using this for those specific sections of waterway, around 12 kilometres, with that quite a high success rate. But if we was to compare that with a mechanical management regime, which would estimate that we'd probably have to do 3 times per annum, you're looking at around 37,000, just under £40,000. And that doesn't account for the additional cost in terms of competitive contractor rates, and also access requirements and disposal costs as well. So it was good to provide a case study for this paper that a link has been shared for. But yeah, it's quite rare to have such an effective biocontrol such as this one, but the cost savings are quite dramatic. We do have to do sometimes mechanical, sometimes we do a pre-mechanical before we do a post-biocontrol as well, especially with the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. We had to ensure that there was a safe navigation and that our network was fit for purpose. So in this sense, we did a mechanical and then a post-biocontrol, but all the areas where we released biological controls in 2021 were effectively all under control. But obviously, where we do have navigation, it can spread plants around, especially as this is a plant that grows vegetatively, predominantly, and through spores. Boating can obviously cause these species to move around. So it's very dynamic on a year-to-year basis. But with the Commonwealth Games, we decided to do some mechanical control in the areas of those canals where we didn't do the biological control in the year before, which does show that the biocontrol was effective. However, you still have to account that all these canals are interconnected and the plant can spread by the uses of the canal system itself. So that's showing you some of the hoppers and types of volumes that we're removing from the Tame Valley Canal, where the Alexander Stadium is. So our canals are obviously interconnected with some quite important areas, especially the Commonwealth Games, which was a very big event for the region. We've also got areas where we're trying to do restoration. So we own, not only do we own a lot of canals, as you can see in the satellite image, in the southern section we've got the Worley and Essendon Canal, but we actually own quite a lot of pools, lakes and reservoirs as well, and some of which I would say that we've not managed probably as effectively as we should, where there has been issues with specific invasives. This one predominantly duckweed, but we have had issues with azolla as well. And this is Bailey's Pool in Walsall, where we're effectively, it's effectively an ecologically dead pool. It used to be a fishery. There's been issues with pollution, specifically from a point source pollution issue. But the dissolved oxygen concentrations have never really recovered. They're often below 10% saturation, regardless of when you measure DO across the different seasons. And as you can see from the bright green colour in the satellite image, it looks more like a field than a pool. So you're starting from a really poor place, but we've been working with Walsall Council, released the site from us, and they've just secured an additional 42k to do site improvements, both on land, whilst we target some of the water-based stuff as well. But really, it's timely in terms of the green infrastructure framework. It's sites like this where they can provide stepping stones. So there's a number of nature reserves in this aspect of Walsall Council. land area. We've got Sneed Reservoir, Bailey's Pool, the Whirling Essington Local Nature Reserve, Roughwood Chase, which is an ancient oak woodland as well. And it's a really good stepping stone site, as well as being part of the Sneed Brook, which is a tributary of the Thames. So by improving these stepping stone sites, you end up getting very good interconnectivity across quite big areas within local authority boundaries as well. So there's a number of triple SIs and slinks and LNRs as well. So hopefully this will be a good stepping stone site between Sneed Reservoir, the Whirling Essington and Oily Goffs Nature Reserve. So it's really, and that's a real big part of the green infrastructure framework in terms of interconnectivity and accessibility as well. The Accessible Green Spaces Standard is quite an important element of that. So it's really important, small but vital green infrastructure and blue infrastructure, which has many connections with important sites. Is it a losing battle? It's a very difficult one. You can see from the top image, that was after we did a mechanical removal regime of aquatic weeds on site. But there's a specific issue with, sadly, a leak in septic tank over the last at least 4 to 5 years, where we've had excessive nutrient inputs into the pool and ultimately into the Sneed Brook. And that leaves a historic phosphorus load specifically as well, which can take, there's a bit of a lag time sometimes between when the nutrients come into a system and the time that they take to be actually either to leave the system or remain in the systems, especially within sediments as well. So it is a long-term management plan that has been developed for this site, but there's also the difficulty in terms of antisocial behaviour, the type of machinery that we use, because there are issues within the actual pool itself in terms of obstruction. So it has to be done safely, but also bearing in mind that there are these external threats to the site that are causing problems. We have thought about maybe installing floating reed bed systems to help with the external nutrient loading, as well as the nutrient loading coming internally as well. But to dredge the sediments from a pool like this, you would easily spend over £1 million. That's obviously not financially viable, and we couldn't allocate funds to something like this because it isn't specifically for navigation, especially the navigation authority. But working in partnership, and it's all about partnerships really, especially with local authorities and other landowners, we can make some difference. We might not completely reverse the tide on the issues that are faced here, but some improvements is better than none, in my opinion. So we shall see how that unfolds over the next 3 to 4 years. Just quickly on biosecurity, this is mentioned in the Environment Improvement Plan. There's a whole goal chapter on enhancing biosecurity, but the check, clean, dry principles has to be embedded within the project, but also in terms of our own operations. And we need to do a lot more on this. We are lagging behind, I would say, but we're trying to really inject that in terms of training, toolbox talks, washdown facilities, and specific biosecurity plans for doing works on protected sites as well. So biosecurity is so important because that's the only way you're going to limit the spread, especially of invasive species and pathogens and all other aspects of biosecurity that are often overlooked. Avian flu, a big part of that, and we've seen that over the last year, where we've had a tremendous amount of cases in terms of avian flu increasing, and that all comes down to effective biosecurity. So that's an area where we definitely need to make improvements. Now, the bit that's fun for me, considering my background is predominantly in water quality, is looking at nutrients and nutrient dynamics within canal systems. As I said before, rivers are very different to canals, the way that they operate, the way that they're managed. Obviously, this is an engineering structure, but it has a very much a net positive in terms of the amount of wildlife and the amount of protected species that we have. And canals, in terms of their water quality, are actually often sad. It's quite a sad state of affairs, but many of the canals often outcompete local rivers for water quality, and that's often a shock for people. But for specific heavy metals, nutrients, even oils, sediments is usually an issue in canals in comparison to rivers. Sediments are the main problem in terms of being a source of contamination, but water quality in canals can actually often be very good, and most of our canals in our region reach the good ecological status standard, or good ecological potential as well, as an artificial water body. We have and that's shown with the amount of protected species such as otters that we have even within the Birmingham Canal navigations as well. So they've got the biological elements as well as all of our chemical monitoring as well. So this was trying to look at a nutrient budget study on the Whirling Essington, which has suffered. Really important canal, It connects a lot of triple SIs and nature reserves within Walsall and Wolverhampton and South Staffordshire. But we wanted to understand sort of the external and internal loading of nutrients, especially phosphorus, but obviously looking at nitrogen and nitrate as well. But whether that was having an impact on, obviously having an impact on aquatic invasive macrophytes, because this canal suffers from a few. But what are the main nutrient sources of this? So you could look at things like surface water sewers, which a lot of people discharge surface water, especially sustainable urban drainage systems, into canals. Agricultural runoff, combined sewer overflows. We don't have many on our national network, let alone on a singular canal. But was there any that we were unaware of? And then also canal sediments potentially being a big part. But the big difficulty with this canal was the fact that we've, in the last 4 to 5 years, we've had a lack of water supply from Chasewater Reservoir. And that's part of the triple SI as well. And we believe that that's exacerbated some of the issues in terms of the since 2017, since that supply has been lost, we've effectively had a significant increase in the likes of water fern, floating pennywort, and even other native species like floating liverwort, which, you know, it can be quite rare, but actually it can become invasive if it's not controlled and it's not managed. So we have to be careful in terms of our navigational requirements as well. So I guess the question is, can targeted dredging of sediments or phosphorus immobilisation, as an example, be the answer to aquatic weed? And is it the answer, really? You know, once they become established in an area, what is the nutrient dynamics within that system, and what can facilitate that growth and spread? And some of it's going to be from our users, but what are the environmental conditions within that system, and how can that be reflected in terms of the species that thrive in that system? So we did an internal loading study looking at sediments. We specifically worked with a consultant, LSI, who we had to ship a lot of our samples back to Europe to do some sequential phosphorus extraction to look at the different forms of phosphorus. So phosphorus that is within the pore water, within the combined with heavy metals such as iron and manganese bound phosphorus. That can be specifically concerning under specific dissolved oxygen conditions, but also the organic phosphorus as well. And we had to, the consultants were able to calculate the different proportions within our canal sediments across 11 specific areas, as you can see on the map of the Worley-in-Essendon Canal. Some of the standouts, you don't have to read the text, but interestingly, when we did the sampling, the surveying for the internal loading aspect on the sediments, the phosphorus concentrations actually within the canal in the water were very low. So you would consider, you know, below 0.01, that is staggeringly low actually for a canal system. And you would assume that that's not a eutrophic system, but that doesn't give you the full image really. So there was around 11.7 kilos of phosphorus within the water column on the day that we did that. But in terms of the sediments, this varied considerably. So we did sliced sediment sampling at 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 centimetres. Canals are very shallow. This canal is around 1.3 to 1.6 metres in depth. So you don't get as much nutrient mixing within these systems. But we wanted to do at different depths of sediment sampling. And some areas we had over 40 kilograms of phosphorus within the top 5 centimetres, but then in some areas it was over 200. So it varied quite considerably. And overall, within the first 5 centimetres, we estimated about 1.13 tonnes of releasable phosphorus. So this was phosphorus that could actually interact with the water column. And then around 2.2 tonnes within the first 10 centimetres. And the vast proportion of this was organic phosphorus. And that's what appears to be a significant nutrient source to the canal. But also, aluminium is an important component as well. So there's aluminium-bound phosphorus. And we estimated around half a tonne of that within the top 10 centimetres. But that will interact on different conditions, so different pH conditions, different dissolved oxygen, anoxic conditions, which can be a big part of phosphorus release. So how that releases under different conditions is really important, but can be quite difficult to model. But we know that there's a significant amount of phosphorus within the sediments, and potentially that is a key part of why we're having these issues with aquatic invasive macrophytes as a nutrient source. And maybe dredging of sediments, and where we have dredged sediments before, we have seen significant reductions in aquatic invasive weed. So potentially that is the answer. Or looking at immobilisation of phosphorus using other products and techniques like potentially phosphlock or other compounds that might be effective at reducing that within the system. And this, we worked with APEM looking at the external loading. So we mapped all of the surface water outfalls. Most of them we classified as low risk, but there's a significant amount that discharge into this system. And we did some land use mapping as well and tried to classify these in terms of which were the highest risks for nutrient inputs. And that then informed our spot location sampling, as well as installing continuous monitors, as you can see on the right-hand side of this, on this graph, where you can see peaks in turbidity, and the peaks in turbidity can often coincide with discharges, but we don't monitor all of the discharges that come into our network. So it can be used as a bit of a proxy in terms of when you get these rapid discharge events, especially if people, landowners, are not reducing the amount of suspended solids that are coming into our canal. Sometimes it can be captured by continuous monitoring. But you see with the dissolved oxygen in the green that we're getting some really low oxygen concentrations, and that effectively could release to a lot of this phosphorus-ridden sediments being released. And ammonium was also used as a bit of a proxy in terms of nutrients coming in, because we couldn't monitor phosphorus by continuous monitoring methods. So it'll be interesting when we do a bit more detailed analysis on this, and it'll be published in June. But understanding the different conditions that could potentially exacerbate the presence and the abundance of certain species is really important, because you might be able to change the environmental conditions. You might be able to reduce water levels, increase flows, tackle nutrients. There's different aspects that you might be able to look at, which may be able to solve some of your problems. And hopefully we'll be able to publish that in June 2023, which I'm very happy to share with all the members and those who are interested in such studies. So that was a whistle-stop tour from me, but thank you very much for listening. And if there's any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Mo.
Oops, as always, thank you, Charles.
No problem.
It's very nice presentation, to say the least, and really pleasing to see that you contributed to the positive contribution of Birmingham Commonwealth Games.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'd be dreading to see that sort of invasive species on the way of any of our water sports.
Yeah.
And also one information that you posed is for the factors that's stopping water to receive its near natural regime. Wastewater is 36% and non-invasive, non-native species is 25%. So being someone from wastewater background, I was quite surprised at the amount of publicity the wastewater is getting.
Yes.
There's no fraction of that publicity attributed to this nuisance of non-native species. So, which I hope with this presentation, our fellow members can get some awareness and spread the word.
Yeah, definitely. I think sometimes there's very much focus on the water quality aspects, quite rightly, but there can often, sometimes in the environmental sector, even with our own environmental professionals, there can be oversight sometimes on some of these other issues like invasive non-native species, where sometimes it could be a case of just lack of awareness or even lack of interest. But actually, when you look at some of the WFD water bodies, especially when we review our own, some of the ecological quality elements are definitely impacted by invasives. And the fact that the Environment Improvement Plan estimates around 25% quarter, you know, that is a significant proportion, and potentially an underestimate as well, because there are many water bodies that are interconnected with others, especially when it comes to canals and rivers. So the transfer risks, even when we look at water companies' plans to do strategic water transfers, Severn Trent, Infinity Water and the like, that has to be a consideration, because if you're going to transfer water from one region to a completely different region, you must ensure that you're not transferring not only the chemical risk, but the invasive and biological risk of spreading non-native species. So that's something that water companies, I think, are definitely focusing more work on, I believe.
So we've got a question from Polly Hawks. I think you touched on a bit that the developers are struggling to deliver biodiversity net gain in rivers. So does River and Canal Trust have got any plan to sell river units with the largest, with the target of spending that fund raised on invasive species or eradication of biodiversity net gain?
Yeah, so this is obviously from a strategic national level, this is currently under discussion, really, looking at biodiversity net gain, because there will be potentially a lot of people who might look to the Canal and River Trust for off-site improvements, especially if they can't do site improvements on their developed land, which in a sense, you know, we hope that most of the work for biodiversity net gain is done on site, because that's where it will probably provide a lot of benefit. But where there are areas where developments where it's much more restricted, then, you know, off-site improvements will be obviously a benefit. We are definitely talking about this. The executive are looking at this from a national perspective of how we would do that, and looking at the different units and whether we will be able to provide, at least use some of the funding to manage some of these areas, such as the invasive species element. So, yeah, you are quite right. We are definitely looking at it. I think there will be a way to do that, but it's just ensuring that if we do get a lot of requests for biodiversity net gain targeted on our own land, we obviously do have a restricted space. But if we can use the funding to manage existing sites to make enhancements and improvements, as I think that's what you're alluding to, that would be great. And I see a real opportunity for that, because, you know, the existing habitats that we do have are already under a lot of stress. So being able to improve them, as well as create new habitat and enhance that, will go a long way, I think, in dealing with some of these issues.
Thanks, Charles. Another question from Paul Smith. How is the current situation with invasive American crayfish?
Yeah, so a lot of my ecologist colleagues tend to do a lot more work on this. So the signal crayfish, which is the one that Paul's mentioning, is definitely a major problem. It can be a problem on certain canals as well. Canals are obviously very accessible, and they do connect with a number of, like, I believe the Grand Union Canal has a significant amount of interconnections with different river catchments. It goes through quite a huge series of these. It is a problem on our network, and it's a problem on a lot of rivers. However, I know that there's a lot of organisations, including the wildlife trusts, and I believe water companies as well, who are looking at ensuring that the white-clawed crayfish, the native crayfish, that where there are stable populations, that these are obviously being managed effectively, and biosecurity comes a big part of that. But also looking at these ARC sites, where you can develop sites where we can almost safeguard a reasonable size of population for some of the native species, and try to prevent the risk of disease being passed or predation occurring from the signal crayfish. But it's definitely a vast problem. And on a lot of the rivers that I previously worked on, especially in the southeast, it was becoming more and more of an issue. So unfortunately, it is very much an established invasive species. But hopefully the great work from all of the different NGOs and water companies and the like will be able to hopefully, you know, at least give a bit more success in terms of the survival of the native white-clawed crayfish. But biosecurity is a big element of that, I think.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks again. Before we go to the next question, probably the final question, Polly Hawks enjoyed the session and gave you a big thanks. Now, one question from Mark Duffel, who is a botanist. It's a two professional talking, so phrasing the question may lost in translation. Bear with me. What is your views on the impact of Elodia canadensis, or Natalie Canadian or Natalie waterweed in water bodies? In my work, I think it is having little impact compared to other species, or at least is the least worst offender. It appears to be more associated with low water quality than a problem in itself. So what's your experience or comment, if any?
Yeah, I somewhat agree with Mark on that respect. Speaking specifically from the Canal and River Trust hat, we do have issues with Canadian nuttall's waterweeds, but They're definitely not as widespread as some of the others, especially the ones that I've mentioned in this project. And to be honest with you, a lot of these, even Cressula is more of a problem on our reservoirs. But as you say, in terms of impact, we've not done as much research on that specifically for canals, but I definitely believe that some of the other invasive plants that we've covered, especially in this slide, in terms of the aquatic ones, are more problematic and have a more direct impact. I also know that, as you've mentioned, I think in your question about water quality as well, that sometimes, as I mentioned in the talk, improving the environmental conditions of the water body itself, especially if it's from a chemical point of view, can actually end up having a much bigger impact. And that was actually notified on the Worley and Essington study. So water fern was hugely abundant on the Worley and Essington. And we released the biological control, which was very effective, and it was significantly reduced that. But we also knew that we had an issue with nutrients from sediments. And the following season, we had a lot of floating liverworts, which, you know, can be quite desirable. The abundance of those species and the yellow water lilies grew substantially. So we got rid of the non-native invasive issue. Well, we managed it for that season, but the following season, some of the native aquatic plants then become very well colonized, and that obviously presented problems for navigation. So it's very much a fine balancing act. But I do tend to agree that, especially for our network, there are other inns that are more problematic. But I'm sure some of my ecologist colleagues could also comment on areas where it is more of a direct impact. But yeah, overall, there's more priority species, and they're often the ones that we targeted in this project.
On the same topic, one from Brian Reed. What's next? Is there any new invasive species you are worried about?
Well, I think from a UK perspective, there's always new invasive species that we're concerned about. A really good example of this actually is the Asian hornet, which is obviously an insect. And the Asian hornet, which is a very problematic species, especially for honeybees and specific pollinators. It arrived in Europe. I believe it arrived in France in 2014. And obviously, as we are an island, we do have somewhat of a buffer, but commercial flights, shipping, all of these different transport routes obviously means that we're not immune to transfer from mainland Europe. But the UK non-native species secretariat is the main body really within DEFRA who cover the strategy and the policy and the framework when it comes to invasives. They worked with a number of consultants and bodies to really anticipate that we almost knew that the Asian hornet would eventually arrive, and I believe it arrived 2 years later in 2016. But because we was already aware, we had alert systems in place, so we worked with volunteers, the public, to ensure that if there was any new sightings of this specific species, that then they would be alerted to DEFRA and the relevant bodies. And that actually worked effectively. And we've had 100% success rate of eradications in Asian hornet species since we had the first arrival. But there's other species that are continually an issue. Some of them may be in the country, but they've not established as well. But it's very important to ensure that the biosecurity aspect is covered and that there's monitoring and surveillance, because we don't want to be in a situation like we are with Japanese knotweed and giant hogweed, where it's all about management of established plants rather than tackling them early and being preventative.
So one last question from Victor when you face challenges with historical information such as septic tank leakage, which have been negatively discharging pollutant to your great work, how do you plan on curbing those challenges?
Yeah, so with regards to the one that I spoke about for Bailey's Pool, we actually directly consult. We directly approached the offending person or the offending company with quite a lot of evidence, and then we obviously contacted the Environment Agency as well as the local authority, who have got, obviously we don't have enforcement powers, even though we're a navigational authority and a huge landowner. We don't have those necessary enforcement powers, so we would have to go through sort of a legal action case of taking the offender to court. So we've notified the Environment Agency and local authority, and the local authority seem like they've done they've sort of got that person on board. Personally, they should be penalised and they should be fined. But unfortunately, that's in the hands of the regulator. We can provide the evidence, but we wouldn't go down the course of taking them to court under legal action, because as a charitable trust, you know, it's hard to manage a 2,000-mile network, and really the regulators should be doing their job with that. The good news is that since we've had that contact with them and we've directly confronted them, we've not seen any more leakages from that septic tank. However, that doesn't mean that it does occur. It just means that when we've gone there to monitor it, we haven't seen anything. But the damage has already been done, and the potential historic phosphorus load could be significant, especially within the sediments of the pool. So really, what we should do is potentially claim costs back of any management interventions to that person, but then trying to provide enough direct evidence to support that led to the growth of those invasive plants can be challenging. So yeah, I think you have to tackle offenders directly, but in terms of cost recovery and all the rest of things, we really are relying on regulators, I'm afraid, to do that.
Thank you very much, Charles. As we are running towards the end of our planned time, we lost few participants. So those who, thank you very much once again. And for the participant who joined this session, please do join in our future events. And also, if you have anything, as mentioned before, anything to present or any topics you want to us to present, please do get in touch. You can leave some comment in chat here, or you can drop an email to CIEEM HQ. They will forward to us.